Most people believe that earning more money automatically changes their financial reality. Yet something subtle happens as income increases that is rarely examined closely. Because the experience of money is not linear, it is psychological, and the way the brain perceives $1,000 compared to $100,000 follows a pattern that quietly reshapes behavior without most people noticing it. Imagine receiving your first $1,000, not as part of a salary, but as a sudden amount in your account, and notice how specific it feels, how clearly you can imagine what it can do, how it carries weight and presence. Because at lower levels, money is concrete. It is tied to immediate decisions, groceries, rent, transport, and small comforts, and the brain processes it with precision, almost like counting individual units that each have visible consequences. Now extend that same perception to $100,000, and something begins to blur because while the number is objectively larger, the brain does not scale its emotional clarity at the same rate. Instead, it compresses the meaning, turning something massive into something abstract, and this abstraction is where behavior begins to shift in ways that are difficult to detect in real time. This is where financial psychology becomes more important than income itself. Because the brain uses mental shortcuts to handle large numbers, a concept often studied in behavioral economics where people rely on what feels manageable rather than what is mathematically accurate. And as numbers grow, the brain simplifies them, rounding, generalizing, and detaching from the granular detail that once guided careful decision-making. At $1,000, spending $100 feels significant. It represents 10%, a visible portion, something that triggers hesitation, but at $100,000, spending $1,000 often feels relatively small, even though the percentage is identical because the brain shifts from percentage thinking to absolute thinking, and absolute numbers lose emotional sharpness as they grow larger. This creates a quiet distortion where larger incomes can reduce sensitivity to proportional loss, and over time this distortion compounds into behavior that looks reasonable on the surface but slowly erodes financial progress. Because decisions are no longer anchored in ratios, they are anchored in vague impressions of affordability. To understand this more clearly, consider a simple comparison where a person earns $10,000 per month and carefully tracks expenses, noticing small changes, adjusting behavior, and maintaining awareness. Then compare that to someone earning $100,000 per month, where the scale introduces complexity, more categories, more transactions, more mental shortcuts, and gradually less attention to each unit of money. Here, mathematical reality remains unchanged. Percentages still govern growth and loss, but the psychological experience shifts. And this gap between math and perception is where many financial trajectories begin to diverge, not because of lack of income, but because of reduced precision in decision-making. Over time, the brain adapts to higher numbers by normalizing them, a process similar to hedonic adaptation, where what once felt significant becomes baseline. And as baseline rises, so does the threshold for what feels meaningful, which means that larger amounts are required to trigger the same level of attention or caution. This is why $1,000 can feel like a milestone early on, while $100,000 can feel insufficient later, even though the latter represents a far greater resource. Because perception is anchored not to absolute value, but to relative expectation and recent experience. From a systems perspective, this creates an interesting dynamic because increasing income without maintaining proportional awareness introduces inefficiency, and inefficiency at scale becomes expensive, not immediately, but gradually, through repeated small decisions that no longer receive the scrutiny they once did. If we break this down mathematically, the key variable is not income itself, but the consistency of percentage-based thinking. Because wealth accumulation depends on maintaining favorable ratios between earning, spending, and investing. And when perception shifts away from ratios toward vague absolutes, those relationships weaken. This is why two individuals with the same income can experience completely different financial outcomes over time, one maintaining clarity at every level, treating 100 out of 1,000 the same way they treat 1,000 out of 100,000, while the other gradually loses sensitivity as numbers grow, allowing inefficiencies to accumulate unnoticed. Historically, this pattern has appeared in different forms across economic environments, where periods of growth often lead to increased spending, not because of necessity, but because of reduced perceived cost. And this is visible not only at the individual level, but also in organizations and entire economies where scaling reduces perceived constraints. The implication is not that higher income creates problems, but that it introduces a new requirement: the need to preserve the same level of awareness that existed at lower levels, even when the numbers become larger and more abstract. Because without that continuity, the psychological experience of money begins to diverge from its mathematical reality. What changes everything is not the amount itself, but the way the mind relates to it. Because once you begin to consistently translate large numbers back into percentages, back into proportional impact, the clarity returns, and decisions regain structure regardless of scale. In that sense, $1,000 and $100,000 are governed by the same underlying rules, but they are experienced differently, and it is that difference in experience, not the difference in value, that quietly shapes financial behavior over time. The shift, then, is subtle but significant, moving from seeing money as a collection of large abstract numbers to seeing it as a system of relationships where every decision carries a proportional effect and where scale does not reduce clarity but instead demands a deeper level of it. And once that shift happens, income stops being the defining factor and awareness becomes the variable that determines whether increasing numbers translate into lasting financial stability or slowly dissolve into unnoticed inefficiency.